trouble connecting with
Bon,
so I don't know if Mr. Hanley got a phone number or something. He can phone him and tell him to get online. Okay, they're reaching out to him anyway.
yes.
But I thought it'd be a good way to use a little bit of time. We got a couple of budgets we have to approve. The first budget for the study of the main estimates 2024-25 was sent to members on Tuesday. Did everybody have the time to look at the budget? And if so, Mr. Small.
We're public, aren't we supposed to be in camera for discussing this stuff?
I haven't got to be. No.
Oh, okay.
All right. So is it the will of the committee to adopt the budget in the amount of $500?
Which study was this for?
That was the one for the main estimates 24-25.
Okay. Yeah.
That's the cost probably for that particular meeting.
The extra sandwiches, Cliff.
Oh,
Yeah. Oh, that hurts, don't it, Cliff? Yeah, that's where you had it. So that one is yes. The second one is the study of derelict and abandoned vessels, which we're about to start soon. Adoption of the budget. The budget for the study of derelict vessels was also sent to members on Tuesday. Did everybody have the time to look at the budget? Is it the will of the committee? Mr. Arnold.
Just some questions, Mr. Chair. Again, it's on the cost of the meals. Is this the amount that's actually being spent? Is this what these snacks are costing us? Or is this a high amount so that it can be adjusted up to that amount if needed?
We have 3 meetings,
Yes?
3 meals.
And snacks.
At a cost of $500 for a few cans of pop, a few trays of food?
No.
We're going to have meals for 3 meals for the study, and other meetings will be snacks. So it's $500 per meal. Yeah.
Our meeting time is expected to shuffle to be at a meal time?
Or not a meal time? Save money if it's not a meal time.
Sorry.
Yes, Mr. Hardy.
I actually kind of half doing this on Ms. Barron's behalf because in looking at where the testimony is due to come from, I see Vancouver. There should be something from Vancouver Island. You know? Oh, you're okay. All right. If you're confident that as long as the island is represented, because that's really ground zero. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
We're talking about the budgets.
I know we're talking about the budget,
Yeah.
but the budget allocated a certain amount into Vancouver, and if we're going to hear from the island, I mean, we'll be sending over the headsets and a lot of other things. So, I mean, if you're comfortable, it's all kosher, I'm
Ms.
happy.
Barron.
Thank you, MP Hardy. I guess I should just clarify. I assumed when looking at this that this meant these are the people who are physically traveling here, the witnesses that we've sent out, and that there'd be additional people not included in the breakdown of provinces that would be witnesses virtually who would receive the headsets, which would also be included in this budget. That's how I had interpreted it. But there are witnesses 100% from Vancouver Island, but I'm assuming based on these numbers that they've all said that their preference is to attend virtually, which of course I always mention to witnesses that it is their choice to come in person or to attend virtually.
Yes, it's an estimate, so I rather have estimated enough people coming in and headsets than doing a supplementary budget at the end of the study. So it doesn't mean that we'll spend all that money on the study.
So I guess just to clarify, should we be including in here then an estimate of some coming from Vancouver Island and not just Vancouver? Because Vancouver Island, of course, is an extra jump over the pond, I guess you could say, than Vancouver.
Well, it's really an estimate. So if they come from Vancouver Island and nobody's coming from Quebec, per se, we can take that money to reimburse the ones from Vancouver Island. So it's just an estimate of where people could come from. So it doesn't mean it's gonna cost that money for everybody's coming in person.
Mr. Arnold.
Thank you. Just further questions on the witness breakdown that's on the budget here. I see three persons from Iqaluit and 3 from Nunavut. When we checked with the Canadian Coast Guard's inventory of wrecked, abandoned, and hazardous vessels, there are no abandoned or wrecked vessels listed in those territories. Just questioning why we would have 6 witnesses from an area that does not have any abandoned or derelict vessels listed on the Coast Guard's list. Inventory.
Yeah, thank you. Here, I can answer some of this question. One thing is that I do know that there are abandoned vessels in the Arctic, which is why we've included the Arctic in the study itself. They are different. I have pictures of them. They're large freighters that have been abandoned. That is a good question as to why they're not listed in the numbers of vessels that have been abandoned. And I think that'd be some good questions for us to ask when we dig into the study. As far as the breakdown of Iqaluit and Nunavik, I'm uncertain how those numbers are broken down and why that way. Again, I think it's just based on an estimate. I don't have any control over that piece. But there are, just to give you that information, MP, oh, my brain. There we go. There are abandoned vessels in the Arctic. Thank you.
Mr. Arnold.
Thanks to MP Barron for clarifying that she believes the Coast Guard's inventory is incorrect or inadequate. It'll be interesting to see that. But now I'll just ask that the clerk can circulate the list of witnesses that have been submitted to the rest of the committee.
Sent to all committee members.
Can I add something?
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to add that I didn't receive any witnesses from the Arctic, so my estimates are really estimates. I don't really have, I went with Iqaluit and Nunavik because they're in the Arctic, but they might be coming from somewhere else, and I didn't know where they would come from.
And as the clerk said, I think she just wanted to make sure she didn't have to come back for a supplementary budget. It doesn't mean we're going to spend that amount. We might spend more and have to come back for a supplementary budget before the study is finished. But we have to land somewhere to get it started. So I think everyone is in agreement with that? Okay, agreed. Now we got to suspend for a witness. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted on June 16, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of population sustainability of Yukon salmon stocks. We welcome on Zoom from the Government of Yukon, the Honourable Niles Clark, Minister of Environment. Thank you for being here today, sir. You will have up to 5 minutes or less for an opening statement. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm attending virtually from Whitehorse, Yukon's capital, and the traditional territory of the Kwalndun First Nation and the Tonquichan Council. Yukon First Nations have been stewards of the Yukon's natural environment since time immemorial. We recognize the tremendous impact that Yukon River salmon decline has had on Yukon First Nations subsistence harvest, culture, food, security, and traditional practices. I also recognize that for years, Yukon First Nations have voluntarily reduced or ceased subsistence salmon fishing to help restore the species and hopefully build a territory where salmon can be harvested by future generations. Low returns witnessed on the Porcupine River recently prompted the Bunta Gwitchin First Nation to implement a comprehensive prohibition on the use of gill nets intended for species such as burbot, whitefish, and pike. We anticipate these types of prohibitions to be implemented by other Yukon First Nations in order to reduce the risk of salmon bycatch in these gill nets. If these prohibitions expand, we expect the need for subsistence harvest to shift to Yukon's freshwater lakes. Officials in our government are responding to these developments by exploring opportunities to partner with Yukon First Nations to identify alternative subsistence fisheries options in order to preserve traditional practices, culture, and food security. Since 2017, Yukon River salmon restoration and recovery has been a topic of joint advocacy by the Yukon government and the Yukon First Nations during our annual Yukon Day missions to Ottawa. The importance of this joint advocacy between governments and other co-management partners continues to be a theme in the discussions that I have been having with Yukon First Nation governments and other partners. At a recent Yukon Forum, a meeting of Yukon First Nations and the Yukon government, the parties suggested the need for an intergovernmental strategy in order to support collaboration and alignment between Canadian co-management partners on Yukon River Chinook salmon restoration. As Minister of Environment, I will be approaching my counterparts in Yukon First Nation governments to develop this intergovernmental strategy. The conversation around the strategy is still in its infancy, but we are hopeful that we can bring together Yukon government and Yukon First Nations leadership to consider such a strategy in the coming months. I'd like to close by welcoming the agreement recently signed by Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Alaskan state government regarding the recovery of Chinook salmon in the Yukon River drainage. The Yukon government was pleased to see that the agreement places a priority on traditional and local knowledge to better understand the causes of low Chinook salmon counts while directing the Yukon River Panel to develop a recovery plan to guide a path forward. We know that the agreement will not fully address the reasons for salmon decline and that our governments will continue to have a role to play in promoting salmon recovery and protecting subsistence fishing opportunities. I am hopeful that through continued collaboration between the Government of Canada and the Government of Yukon, First Nations governments, and other co-management partners, we can continue to lay the groundwork for a long recovery of Yukon River salmon. Finally, I want to note that I will be in Ottawa later this month to attend the meeting of federal, provincial, and territorial ministers responsible for conservation, wildlife, biodiversity, where conservation for the protection of species at risk, like salmon, will continue. Thank you so much for the opportunity to provide opening remarks.
Thank you for that. And we'll now go to our rounds of questioning. We'll start off for 6 minutes or less with Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Clark, for being here. Appreciate your input from right there in the territory of where this is happening. I'd like to just ask you briefly if you have any indications or basically how did things get this bad that the numbers are so low? Obviously, this isn't just a short-term result, but how did they get this bad?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And just for clarification, how much time do I have for each answer? Or approximately?
Well, I only have 6 minutes total.
Oh, okay. You have 6 minutes. Okay. Thank you.
What you were saying too.
The decline of Yukon River salmon cannot be attributed to a single cause. Instead, it results from multiple factors affected both the marine and freshwater environments. In the marine environment, Yukon River salmon face intense competition for resources against foreign hatchery-bred salmon. Additionally, they must contend with changing ocean temperatures and bycatch mortality in the North Pacific marine fishery. If they survive these marine challenges, they will encounter further difficulties in the freshwater environment. Beginning the longest migration in the world in a weakened state, they face threats from increasing river temperatures, Alaskan harvest, migratory barriers.
I'm going to interrupt you there, Mr. Clark,
sir.
With all respect. It looks like that is a prepared response. Could I ask you to provide that to the committee in writing in the effort of saving time here and really get to the key points that you think are the reason for things getting this bad?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. But the bottom line is that these are. I'm sure that you have heard that from the other members, such as the other witnesses who have provided answers, such as Chief Frost, Chief Nicole Tom, Tim Gerberding, Brady Mays, and Bryce Bakar from various First Nations. Bryce Bakar from the Yukon Fish and Game Association.
Okay, I'll be a little more direct then.
Thank you.
Has it been inaction of either the Yukon Territorial Government, the Canadian government, the U.S. government, or any government that has in part or totally led to this?
I mean, I notwithstanding the admission that I have prepared comments, these are the reasons for the decline. I think the biggest challenge recently has been that subsistence fishing on the American side between Eagle and Nome, basically, is interpreted as being the fishing of salmon at a certain level, which has been quite significant. But so ultimately, I met with Commissioner Vincent Lang of the state of Alaska, who's the Fisheries and Wildlife Commissioner, and there is an agreement now to try to reach by a passage level at Eagle, so from Alaska into Yukon, of 70,000 fish. The numbers right now, I can check right now. In previous years, the return, like in 2023, 15,304 Yukon River Chinook entered Canada, far short of the preseason estimate of 26,000 to 43,000.
I think I get where you're going with this, that there's been possibly excessive catch on the American side. Are you aware of any diplomacy between the federal fisheries minister and U.S. counterpart to address this, or has it all been done by the Yukon representatives?
No, I'm not aware of the active discussions had. I know that they are occurring between DFO and the federal government. However, there is now the Yukon River Salmon Subcommittee. There is an agreement now for a full cycle of the salmon, so for 7 years, to limit catch to try to reach an escapement goal of 70,000 fish. And I know that the Alaskans. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. We're aware of the Yukon agreement that has recently been signed.
Okay.
Just quickly, because we've got a minute left. What have you learned about the impacts or the effectiveness of the Pacific Salmon Treaty in the sustainability of the Yukon River salmon, specific to the treaty and its effect on Canadian fisheries?
So the salmon treaty. Well, I know that the fund, like many funds, have been dedicated for the BC West Coast. I know that our government, both the Premier and I, are advocating with the federal government to divert some of the funds that have been provided specifically for BC salmon restoration to be diverted to the Yukon River restoration efforts, and those discussions continue. So, and we know that they were not insubstantial funding that was provided to enable the BC salmon restoration. So, yes, those discussions are ongoing. But just to finish, I know you are finished, and thank you for your questions. We are cautiously optimistic based on the concessions that have been made by our Alaskan friends and neighbors with respect to trying to preserve this 7-year cycle of salmon and increasing the escapement goal to 70,000. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Clark, good to see you. And good to see a little peek at the Yukon out the windows behind you as well. So I wonder, I mean, really building on Mr. Arnold's questions, I don't think we have certainly heard how important this 7-year moratorium is, a full cycle moratorium, and how significant that is. But many people have, many of our witnesses have expressed that this is really a beginning and not an end, and certainly not a measure in itself that will be sufficient. So I was happy to hear you talk about the intergovernmental strategy. Maybe you can tell me a bit more about what your vision is as a minister in terms of the Yukon government role to protect and rebuild salmon, and maybe a little more about the intergovernmental strategy.
Thank you, MP Hanley. So there are a number of possible initiatives, and I believe that the Yukon government and my ministry does want to occupy the field in a more significant manner. But so I do have some examples of where we're going. The Department of Environment supports the idea of a Yukon-based conservation hatchery, and we are continuing discussions with Fisheries and Oceans Canada and Yukon First Nations to provide support when called upon. Department of Environment staff have met with the Kwanlin-Dun First Nation, which is the largest First Nation in the Yukon and is largely a urban Whitehorse First Nation. We met on September the 11th, 2023, in order to discuss how the department can support the development of the new Kwanlin-Dun First Nation Salmon Stewardship Center, which will include a Kwanlin-Dun First Nation-led conservation hatchery feasibility study. We will continue to work with Kwanlin-Dun First Nation to support this project and look forward to the next steps as well.
Okay, Minister.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to pull Mr. Arnold and ask you to submit the rest of that in writing, if you could, because I just wanted to change topics in the small amount of time that I have.
Thank you.
We have heard from at least some witnesses, and certainly I've heard lots of concern about the interplay between resource extraction and salmon habitat. And I wonder, as Environment Minister, if you could comment on what your assessment is of that interaction.
Thank you, MP Hanley, and I do have somewhat comprehensive notes on this, but I will try to provide a relatively quick summary. Yukon Government and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and decision bodies during the environmental assessment reviews of placer mining projects and its impacts on salmon and salmon habitat. Both governments consult with impacted First Nations to mitigate impacts to salmon and other fisheries before entering the licensing stage by the Yukon Water Board. During the licensing stage, the Yukon Water Board will consider the fish habitat management system for Yukon placer mining, as well as terms and conditions related to diversions, settling, and suspended and settlable sediment discharge standards of each creek. If a placer mining project is allowed to proceed after assessment and regulatory reviews, monitoring programs are in place under the fish habitat management system in order to ensure objectives of fish habitat management system are achieved. The Fish Habitat Management System aims to protect fish and fish habitat while supporting a sustainable placer industry. This management system is a requirement of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and jointly enforced by Yukon Government's Compliance Monitoring and Inspections Office. Yukon remains committed to working with DFO on the ongoing administration of the Fish Habitat Management System for Yukon placer mining. So.
Thank you. And maybe I have a minute or so left. And you mentioned the idea of a conservation hatchery. Again, we've heard about the potential for restoration using hatcheries. There are different interpretations, different types of hatcheries, but a conservation hatchery is certainly one thing I know which is receiving serious interest in the territory. And I wonder if you can tell me a bit more about what the idea, what the vision, what the plans are for Yukon River Conservation Hatchery is.
Thank you. And cognizant of the fact that I likely have less than a minute, I would just say that I would repeat my comments about the fruitful conversations that we're having with Kwanlin Dunn. The Department of Environment officials have met with all 14 Yukon First Nations, 11 self-governing, 3 non-self-governing First Nations, and we believe that it's about 7-7 as far as support for hatcheries, but we have certainly heard loud and clear that we have got to do something because the Yukon River salmon are in danger of extirpation, and that's obviously would be absolutely devastating for all Yukoners, but certainly for all Yukon First Nation persons who have been here since time immemorial. So,
Thank you. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Bonjour.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, Minister, to have you with us. I'm from Quebec and I represent the Quebec fishery. I just want to know, do you have meetings, communications, consultations with your Quebec counterpart on fishery issues, the problems surrounding the salmon in Quebec?
Thank you so much. It's Madame Vice Chair Debienne. Thank you so much for that question. I would say that I should probably. I am certainly open to sharing the opportunity to receive the experiences of my Quebec counterparts. I haven't had a lot. I must say I have not had a lot of meetings with the Quebec counterparts, but I'm open. And our department is certainly open to sharing their experiences and possible solutions and move and paths forward to restoration. Certainly cognizant of the fact that it may very well be that Quebec has similar circumstances. So thank you very much for that suggestion. And of course, it's important to receive and process and hopefully use some of the experiences of our friends and colleagues from across this country. So.
Merci, c'est très intéressant de...
Thank you. It's interesting to hear you on that topic. We don't necessarily have the same issues in Quebec. The fishery is somewhat different, but we do have certain points that we can look at together. Other witnesses have talked about intensifying the collaboration with the United States. Putting in place a mechanism that is truly efficient, that can more aggressively fight against climate change and some of the impacts that flow from overfishing. There is this issue of overfishing and bycatches. Do you have communications with the United States? Is there some mechanism in place or that has been set up recently to look at those issues?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. And I think it was in my response to Vice Chair Arnold, where I think I did provide a bit of information on that response. But what I would just confirm is that in February, the governor, Michael Dunleavy, the governor of Alaska, attended Whitehorse with 3 of his commissioners, and there was the transportation commissioner and the fish and game commissioner, and that was the first in-person meeting which had occurred between Alaska and Yukon in a number of years. So we had conversations on infrastructure and on Yukon River salmon and on a number of topics, and that's where, in speaking to Commissioner Vincent Lang at that time, he advised that notwithstanding the concerns and the pushback that he had received from Alaskan First Nation villages between Eagle and Nome, which I talked about previously, that they were very much opposed to those restrictions, that it was deemed to be contrary to Indigenous harvesting rights in Alaska. But notwithstanding, they are of the view that we must proceed with this agreement to try to reach 70,000 fish passing Eagle, Alaska, whereas this last summer it was only 15,000. So yes, so the answer to your question is yes. We are having meetings with our Alaskan counterparts. I've met by Zoom, I've met in person with Commissioner Vincent Lang, and I meet with other commissioners as well, because obviously Alaska is notwithstanding it's an international relationship, it's they're an incredibly important partner. And the more in-person dialogue and Zoom dialogue that we have with Alaska, we believe the greater likelihood we have of success of avoiding the extirpation of the Yukon River salmon.
Si je comprends bien, il y a une sensibilité.
So if I understand you well, there is a real interest on the U.S. side. So you're trying to come up with solutions. Everyone is.
Je peux recommencer. Si je comprends bien,
So if I understand you, you're actively seeking solutions, working together with the United States. It is not just diplomacy, courtesy. You are concretely, you have your feet on the ground, seeking solutions.
Absolutely. As I said, the 3 commissioners and the governor of Alaska came to Whitehorse in February. I plan to return the visit. I'll either be in Juneau or Fairbanks or Anchorage and meet with my counterparts there as well, and to continue the advocacy to advance this file. So I guess, I mean, speaking for myself, but I am cautiously optimistic that we are moving in a direction, in a positive direction. So yes, the answer is yes. We're having positive discussions on a number of topics involving wildlife and wildlife preservation between our Alaskan friends and the Yukon government, and that's why we certainly do want to have a role. And I know that MP Hanley is passionate on this topic as well, and we certainly. He having traveled to Washington with a Yukon delegation within the last year. So yes, we recognize that concrete discussions have to occur with Alaska.
Okay, thank you for that, Madam Debienne. Before I go to Ms. Barron, we're on the 5:30 mark. I need unanimous consent to go beyond that time. We're good till 5:50, and we have another almost 10 minutes with Minister Clark and then 10 minutes of drafting instructions, if everybody is in agreement. Okay, agreed? So we'll go now to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please, with Minister Clark.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Minister Clark. Thank you for being here. My first question, Minister, I heard you speaking to this a little bit already, but we have heard from witnesses already to date talking about the chiefs and First Nation representatives and so on, about the serious hardship and strain that the lack of access to salmon places on their communities culturally traditions, language, food security. There's many ways in which the lack of access to salmon is impacting these communities. And you spoke about this in the Whitehorse Star article, which I have with me today, and you were talking about the great sacrifice of Yukon First Nations. And so I know you spoke a little bit about what it is that the Yukon government's doing. Perhaps you might want to add a piece or two to that. But I'm wondering if you can share what you feel that the Canadian that the Liberal federal government needs to be doing to ensure that First Nations are not disproportionately impacted by this agreement.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, MP Barron. Thank you for the question. So what did I say in the Whitehorse Star? But but in any event, hopefully reasonable things. What I would say is that Yukon First Nations, over the course of the last 30 years now, and it has occurred over the last 30 years, have absolutely made the ultimate sacrifice with respect to subsistence harvesting. So what I would say is that Yukon First Nation governments and citizens have already paid the so-called ultimate price, or have made the most significant sacrifice. And that's why it has been incredibly important for us to dialogue with Alaska, because we want to have Alaska First Nation villages and First Nation governments and beneficiaries and Yukon First Nation persons to have the benefit. And absolutely, it is culture. You have heard from the prior witnesses. It's the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation, the Tronda Quichin, where they had, a commercial salmon fishery. The pictures from the 1930s and the 40s and the 50s, even into the 60s, of really substantial fishing camps on the Yukon River, on the Pelly River, on the Stewart River, which they are not occurring. So as I think I said in my prior comments, yes, as far as the general Pacific salmon restoration theory, we will continue to lobby for the federal government to provide resources for Yukon to continue with our solid work for restoration. But the answer to your question, MP Barron, is that the Yukon First Nation governments and their citizens have borne the price and the responsibility now for starting 30 years ago, and then the fishery just got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and essentially became non-existent. So that's why I, as the Minister of Environment for the Yukon, and our government want to play an important role. Play an important role. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I feel like there was some important points that you made in there. Minister, there was a brief presented to us as a committee from the Yukon Salmon Subcommittee. And perhaps, I'm not sure, just to make sure that you're aware of what I'm talking about. It says the government of Yukon asserts that the government of Canada is responsible for salmon and accordingly takes little action to protect salmon in the regulation of Yukon land uses like mining. The government of Canada defers to the government of Yukon when it comes to decisions over land use in Yukon. The result is that salmon habitat in Yukon is not well protected, with neither government actively taking responsibility. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that submission and the critique that the government of Yukon is not actively taking responsibility for protecting salmon habitat.
Thank you for that question. I have, as I think I've stated a few times today, I have no interest in in my time in this ministry, I have no time. I have no intention of continuing to just say that the federal government is the only responsible party, but they are the senior level of government, and they do have that responsibility. But I think it is easy. It is easy for the Yukon government to say, and we will defer, and we will not do anything. So I think I've provided some insight as to what we are doing, but just in general, we are working with Yukon First Nations to address some of the concerns, including improving fish passage across Yukon hydroelectric projects, building relationships to discuss the feasibility of conservation hatcheries, which you've heard about from me over the course of my testimony here, protecting areas of cultural importance in our fish habitat management program, and working with all our partners to develop a Yukon River salmon rebuilding plan. So, as I said, I have no interest in just having the simple answer that Department of Fisheries and Ocean and the federal government, is the only party that can come up with reasonable solutions. And just to repeat myself, I said, "Oh, you're repeating yourself," but just to repeat myself, I believe that it has been incredibly important to open those lines of dialogue with the great state of Alaska, with in-person meetings, and maintaining those lines of communication, because that's probably the biggest headway that has been made in the last, it's probably in the last number of years. So I accept some of the criticism, but absolutely want to move forward and occupy more of the space for all Yukon First Nation governments and for all Yukoners.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. That comes to an end our time in public. We now have to suspend for a moment to go to in-camera for drafting instructions. So I want to thank Minister Clark for his time here today and sharing his knowledge of the Yukon salmon and the pros and cons and the ups and downs that's happening in that particular stock in their area. So we'll suspend for a moment to go in camera, and I'll allow Mr. Minister Clark to leave at his leisure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to